I probably take a POI from CO at about 5 minutes into my speech after my second argument. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. When the United States dropped nuclear bombs and killed hundreds of thousands of innocent Japanese civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the majority of the American population supported that. What a heinous war crime and a profound violation of the sanctity of human life. What a stain on the United States and its population with little historical parallel. Why was that heinous crime supported by the majority of the US population? We would say at opening government, it was because they were subjected to years of propaganda that taught them to see the Japanese people as evil and subhuman. That's why we oppose this propaganda. How is it done? Broadly, I think I've already characterized it in my introduction, but I think this kind of propaganda looks like demonstrating your opposition in the war to be people and like animals, like demons, like spiritual forces of evil. And we think it often plays on racial tropes that already exist how people see others. So it looks like posters from World War II that portray Japanese people to be ghost-like creatures of evil. What do we think the counterfactual is in this debate? Now, we obviously aren't going to be as bold to say that no wartime propaganda is going to exist whatsoever, but we would probably just have propaganda now that emphasizes glory. And the thing to note about this is that these two things are not mutually exclusive. So there already is propaganda that is concomitant with propaganda that dehumanizes the victims or the opposition. But what we're doing is probably making the propaganda that depicts the army as glorious be the only kind of propaganda. So there's no new, unique kind of propaganda that comes into this debate. We're going to demonstrate that that propaganda is less persuasive through 3 arguments. We think this propaganda prolongs wars. We think this propaganda justifies and makes draconian war practices comparatively more likely. And we think it makes it far more likely that people support racism within their own countries. On the first harm, though, why does this prolong war? The first claim we will make is to establish the connection between the public's perception and the way they receive propaganda and how long wars go. And we think there are 2 broad connections that are to be made. The first is that all governments, or at least most governments that wage wars, are democratically accountable, and so their population can withdraw their consent for wars through massive scale civil disobedience or by simply voting that government out. But oftentimes the government implicitly relies on the support of the population for prosecution, for war morale, for people to, for instance, keep enlisting to fight in the conflict, for direct production of things that are useful in the war effort. So if we're able to establish that this narrative leads to greater political support for war, then we're able to establish that wars get prolonged as a result of that perception. There are 4 reasons that we think that people's perception increases of war. The first is they begin to viscerally hate the opposition. And just to preemptively be comparative here, we think visceral hatred of another person is far more powerful than thinking your nation state is superior to them, for the reason that hatred is a much deeper emotion because it is far more primal and because it is far less easy to interrogate and critique. Secondly, we do not care about you don't stop caring about the damage done to other people because you don't see them as worthy of civil rights or human rights, so you think the war should completely destroy the country. Thirdly, you disbelieve in peace efforts because you believe the other actors are irrational and you could never negotiate with them. And fourthly, you fundamentally distrust them even if you come to peace agreements and you support war efforts continuing. Just kind of facile, I think I'll prove that war is bad. It leads to millions of deaths. When war happens, war crimes also happens. That's sexual assault, that's torture, that's entire cities of civilians being razed to the ground. We think that's immoral, but we also think it destabilizes the economies of countries that get into wars for decades. It looks like Germany, which took literally decades to recover after its set of world wars that it waged. We think war is bad. We think this propaganda prolongs war, makes it more likely in a way that is deeply, deeply immoral. All right, next argument. Why does this make you more likely to support draconian war practices? First thing to establish, why are people aware of draconian war practices? Well, 3 reasons. First, there are media reports on them. Secondly, there's word of mouth because many people are soldiers and they're reported back to their families. But thirdly, we've already reasoned out before why governments are tangibly responsive to the public. So that probably establishes that they're aware. I think this makes it far more likely that you have latitude to do war crimes because the public simply disregards them when they consider their public support for wars. But what are the reasons for this? The first is that you disregard people as being worthy of civil rights. Usually when you consider other humans as being worthy of civil rights, you see them as being human, which means they're entitled not to be killed in a war or innocent civilians to have their cities razed to the ground. You now don't support that. You think there's such a threat that you must retaliate to the extent that you must go down to sink to their depths in order to destroy them totally. But soldiers also see this propaganda and they respond to it viscerally with hatred during that conflict. The impact of this is sexual assault of civilians, torture, the PTSD of them and your enemies hating you far more and those wars being far more bloody and horrible. That's a principal affront to human dignity and it destroys values that we hold dear. I'll take Sierra.
Yeah, so given wars are so costly as you characterize, why do nations go to war in the first place?
Okay, so I guess the claim here is that, nations go to wars for much deeper reasons than war propaganda. And we obviously agree. The claim we make is that there are a lot of factors which determine how long wars go, what kinds of things happen in wars, what the public supports when it comes to war, and that propaganda obviously increases those kinds of things. Our claim is never that we prevent wars from happening as a result. At the end of the speech, I'm going to establish why this increases racism. 2 very facile, but I think important premises. The first is that wars are often inter-ethnic because countries are often defined on ethnic grounds. But also, the second premise is that the people of the opposite ethnic group are often in your country. So it looks like Ukrainians living in the West and Russians living in the West during this conflict. So why does this lead to racism? You need to use racial tropes in the propaganda to connect viscerally with people. People associate that ethnic group with their fear and loathing and dehumanized groups, and they think you cannot trust them. The consequences of that is direct violence against certain ethnic groups. The fact that you support internment camps for those ethnic groups in your country, you support forced emigration efforts of that group, for instance, like how the German people supported internment camps of the Jews. And we think just fundamentally, it's principally wrong if your wartime propaganda leads to racism. I actually could never have been prouder to be on opening document.
I thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Maybe now have the Leader of Opposition to propose a case for the side off.
Hello, just want to confirm that I'm clear and audible.
Yep.
Okay, hi, my name is Neackle, pronouns are she, they, for POIs, please send them in chat. Possible trigger warnings, mentions of violence, war crimes, stuff like that. Just a short shout out to Gab, hello, here's your shout out, cool. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, in situations in which we are reduced to pawns and human shields, we think the urgency is to be able to incite action from a multitude of actors to ensure that we end the war faster and we're at the winning side of it, as opposed to like the constant narrative of losing the war and stuff like that. If government says that no one really wins a war, we all lose, we say that at face value, there will always be the losing end or the side that's considered as the aggressor, and either way, war pushes us to lose our humanity, so we don't really see any value in attempting to humanize and rationalize the actions of aggressors and people who pose a direct threat to the safety of the state and its civilians. We think when we talk about wartime propaganda, it's there for 3 reasons. First, it's to be able to incite action in the form of the nations. It's to be able to make sure that we get sanctions from other external actors as well, because this doesn't only apply to people on the ground in these countries, but also to other countries as well who are interacting with you in the political arena. But also, very lastly, it's for us to be able to shape public opinion. We understand that and stuff like that. But we think we'd like to clarify what dehumanizing actually looks like, because this probably looks like portraying the enemy as deprived of human qualities like empathy, emotion, and reason. This either looks like vilifying them or portraying their values as regressive and savage and separate from being human and humanity in general. So it's not just turning these people into like this myths or monsters or creating a narrative it's also about separating them from what humanity stands for. So even if it's a play on racial tropes, I think that war is special circumstances in which these sensibilities take a backseat because there's a life and death situation on the line and people on the ground are constantly being threatened by these things, right? Few responses. First, they said that it prolongs war. They have to understand that the aggressive action or making sure that we have public support for war isn't to prolong it and end up at a stalemate. It probably means that we're trying to make sure that we end the war faster, and just withdrawing it would probably means we're succumbing to their aggression and stuff like that, and that's worse off. But second response really quickly, we think that this debate happens in a special context of war. So it's at the end point of the spectrum. So it's the last resort. This means that things like negotiations, things like conversations have already happened and we've already tried to appeal to emotion or reason, but those things ultimately fail. That's why we're in war to begin with, right? So either way, the negotiations and compassion that they want on OG are highly unlikely to happen either way. And things like deporting people probably already happened because you're in the middle of the war, not at the threat of it, wherein you're still considering all these factors anyways. But lastly, we think war crimes don't magically become legal and acceptable just because you have propaganda on our side. You still have the imperative to justify your cause and make sure you're fighting a just war. You're still accountable to multiple international courts and institutions that were built in response to how bad war was conducted in the past. OG seems to be operating 100 years back and are already boxed out of this debate. Also, the last thing they said was that it leads to racism. First, racism exists either way, but we think that it's no longer the burden of the state to completely sanitize how these people are viewed because they're still vilified anyways, even without this propaganda. It only when you only show the gore, there's still going to be a threat to your safety and humanity. They're still likely to oppose these people and root hatred in these things. First case, really quickly, why is this the kind? Why is this kind of propaganda justified in the very first place? First level, what actually happens in war, anyways? Because there seems to be an intricacy that they largely miss, although the debate is entirely set in a context of war, right? We think war shows no mercy and it chooses no one. The reality is you're constantly exposed to violence and a severe lack of regard for human life and compassion, regardless of what side you're on in this war, right? This looks like people being treated as pawns for the bigger picture. Only the higher ups and people on the top of the chain of command can fully see and understand. This means that states that are usually in war probably have ethnic and religious reasons for conflict or political agendas that they hold to a high regard. This means that they also place a large emphasis on things like humanity. This means that people feel uncomfortable with the idea of attacking someone unless they're fed with the narrative that these are irredeemable or less than us, less than human, and stuff like that, right? So we think the principles of self-defense and sovereignty are no longer enough to be able to mobilize people at war and make sure that we're actually fighting these things and trying to win it, as opposed to want to retreat and maintain a very defensive stance that's probably only going to prolong the war, conversely, on their side, right? Especially when they're paralyzed by fear and moral dilemmas at the constant attempt of trying to rationalize the actions of people who are constantly pointing their guns at you. Second level, why is this propaganda so important? Anyways, we think the purpose of wartime propaganda is to be able to incite action, as we established earlier. We think in terms of the nations, it's extremely important for you to paint the enemy as this way because it deliberately emphasizes the vulnerability of your country and the people who are being affected by this war. And that's how you get humanitarian action from larger actors. That's how you're able to get things like assistance and donations. But also, this is also how you incite sanctions because these people probably think that they're going to mess up with their economic activity and stuff like that. But when you paint these people as irredeemable, when you paint these countries as aggressors that are so far detached from humanity, you're able to incite action such as sanctions. But lastly, in terms of public opinion, we think this is important because this is how we approve policies and military spending. This is how we justify our actions. We agree with opening government, but we think it's not so bad because at the very end of the day, you're still being held accountable by other check and balances like international courts to ensure that you don't carelessly commit war crimes and stuff like that. Like we agree that it happens, but there are mitigating factors to ensure that these things are minimized anyways. Like how do people on the ground perceive propaganda anyways? Like we think people on the ground are very simple. They don't have the emotional capacity in times of war to be able to comprehend that these people are also struggling, that these people are only pushed to the brink of like desperation and stuff like that. That's why they're attacking us. And they only see things in black and white. So we think it's perfectly justified for us to completely vilify them as as opposed to trying to co-opt the model of government in this debate, right? Like, what are the likely alternatives on government to as compared to dehumanizing propaganda? First, they're likely to probably appeal to reason and explain the intricacies of war and why we're attacking these countries anyways. And we think that's usually intellectualized and highly inaccessible, and you're only putting people on the ground at further risk because they're unable to access these sort of narratives and ensure that they understand these things. But secondly, you're probably going to try to humanize and paint these people as trapped by circumstances. And I think that won't work because people on the ground have limited capacities to reconcile that the fact that these people are the same people killing their families and stuff like that. Moreover, people on the ground see things as black and white. Unless we completely vilify them or appeal to an extreme sense of morality, we're unable to get the public support that we need to be able to launch a missile, for example, or try to negotiate with the rest of the international community to impose sanctions on our aggressors. Or like what they mentioned, which is just plain gore and numbers of people dying. We think that's already failing in status quo. People don't see the gravity of these actions unless you vilify them completely. Thanks.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. Maybe now have the Deputy Prime Minister to extend the opening up case.
Hey, sorry, just 1 second. I will take my POIs in the chat, just stick in your team, and I will take you at some point. A lot of paper. All right. 3, 2, 1. This is an opening opposition team who thinks it's a good idea that we get more people to go to war who hate their enemy more and more willing to do bad things. In order to justify that, you need to believe at the end of this debate that war is a net good thing, something that is insane, which is why opening opposition is already out. I'm going to briefly deal with opening opposition. It won't take very long. Then I'm going to weigh our material, and then I'm going to bring you a point of substantive. Let's talk about opening opposition. The first observation I would make about them is that they establish what they say that the comparative will be, which is that it will be things like appeals to reason, which they say are ineffective. I would note, I'm not rebutting this. What I'm just pointing out here is that this is the comparative that they set up in the debate. Closing opposition cannot disagree with that comparative for the reason that it will be a knife. That is the comparative that you must agree with for the rest of the debate. What claims do they make? The first claim they make is we're going to add more troops, so we're going to end the war faster. First, in terms of ending the war faster, often adding more troops does not end the war faster for the reason there are structural barriers to ending the war. For instance, the fact that you cannot take over a particular country because that country will try and do guerrilla tactics against you. For instance, you could not have won the Vietnam War by just adding more troops for the reason that there were structural barriers to winning. Adding more troops just added up the bloodshed. Secondly, the ending of a war is often the most brutal and awful parts of that war. This is a harm. Think about what the Soviets did when they took Germany, the amount of people that they raped and tortured on the way in. The fact that this opening opposition team is standing for that kind of ending of the war instantly puts them out. And third, we are opposing this overall. So on your side, both countries just get more of these troops, right? Both countries are going to use the dehumanizing. Both countries get more troops. So no country gets an advantage. It doesn't end the war faster anyway. Their next claim is this will only be used as a last resort. No, it wouldn't only be used as a last resort. First, they cannot frame that they would only support using it as a last resort, not to get too technocratic, but like World's Judging Manual, opposed support debates, you need to support it in totality. They would need to prove that it is a last resort. I would suggest it would not be used as a last resort for 3 reasons. First, it's often the easiest thing to do. It's the easiest, laziest way to do this form of war propaganda. Second, it's the most certain to work, so risk-averse governments are likely to go and use it. And third, it's what they've done in the past, and governments tend to rely on previous forms of propaganda. That suggests it would not be used as the last resort. Their final claim is that this kind of dehumanization is justified for the reason that these people are bad. First of all, no, we're talking about both countries. So if we're talking about 2 countries in a conflict, right? Necessarily, one of them, if they believe that this right-wrong thing exists, which they necessarily do to say they are wrong, therefore it's all right, Therefore, necessarily, one of the two countries is using it against a country who is not wrong. Second, I would say that this form of dehumanization, stripping people of their basic human dignity, is never justified. And third, note that this is a defensive claim. The fact that something is justified is not a reason to believe that we should do it. That doesn't prove we should do it. It just goes against our principle, which I've already shown why it is always principally wrong to dehumanize people, especially when you cannot be certain of right, and necessarily half of the people doing this are in the wrong. And even if you believe it, it's a defensive contribution. Being justified is not a reason to believe that something should happen. What kind of contributions do we make? The first contribution, actually, I'll take closing opposition if you got something.
Yeah, so why would it be effective to use propaganda to galvanize people to act in cases where you are superior to your opponents?
Right, because superior does not mean that they are not a threat, right? You can think of them as base animals, but animals can still be violent. Animals can still be threatening. Demons and evil little spirits can still be threatening. And you believe that where you are superior, that is because they are of low moral character and therefore A, deserve everything that comes to them, and B, you can never trust them. You can never make peace. You can never negotiate. And even if you did make peace, you would have no faith that they would allow that peace to actually come to fruition, that they wouldn't just give it up and attack you instead. That's why you continue to attack people. The first claim that we make is that war goes on for much, much longer. So the claim that comes in a point of information from closing opposition to my prime minister is that no, they go for other reasons. First, we point out that wars often require the support of the public for the reasons that Oski gives you. Oski gives you 3 mechanistic reasons here. They cannot just go with an assertion. There are other reasons. Second, even if there are other reasons, right? How the public feels about a war often changes how long and how violent it is. Third, empirically, there are lots of examples in which a lack of public support is the thing that made a war end. And I will point, for instance, to Vietnam. The reason the US pulled out of Vietnam is because people lost public support. If on our side people lose public support, that means that people pull out. The fact that we ensure people lose public support means that we don't get those longer wars. Vietnam doesn't go on for longer. Fourth, I note this is just mitigation. Even if some wars still happen, that does not actually respond to all of our harms. We give you 4 reasons why war goes on longer. And I'm going to add a 5th one here substantively, which is that often your propaganda is seen in that other country. So those individuals see that you have been saying evil things about them and therefore they hate you more. War is very bad. I'm not going to impact this, self-explanatory. Second claim we make is that there's simply more draconian war. You're more likely to do things like commit war crimes. The single response that we get is, oh, war crimes are crimes and therefore would not be done. First, international law that prevents war crimes is often not enforced. Second, many states just do not have laws against torture. Third, many groups of soldiers never have the law enforced against them for the reason that states see it as anti-patriotic to convict soldiers who were in the line fighting for our freedom. And fourth, many states often take away these forms of laws in times of, for instance, crisis such as war. And fifth, empirically, they have to wrestle with the fact that torture was cheered by supporters of Donald Trump when he talked about reopening Guantanamo Bay and doing more torture. Final contribution we give you is that there's likely to be far more racism within this country. And racism extends the war, right? Because when you are more racist against a set of people, then you are more likely to go to war with them. But more importantly, this is incredibly bad for your internal country. There is much racism in Australia today towards Chinese people for the reason that we used anti-Chinese propaganda during the Cold War to scare people. And that impact on your country is incredibly long-term. Using this kind of propaganda leads to much worse racism in that country in the long term. Those 3 contributions are absolutely enormous and absolutely sufficient to win opening government this debate. Final thing I'm going to do is introduce substantively why war propaganda often spills over into other forms of media and leads to racist tropes in that media. That is first, because often the film industry itself is mobilized in order to create, and the various media industries are mobilized in order to create this propaganda. So you inculcate those producers and directors and writers with those racist tropes. Second, any form of disagreement with these kinds of war propaganda about dehumanizing them is seen as being traitorous to that nation. So you have to go along with the propaganda line. And third, this now sets norms in the population about what people consume and what people believe that other forms of media are likely to latch onto. The impact of this is that your domestic media now picks up on these sets of racist narratives, and it does things like continue to follow them through and continue to have racism in your country long after the war. At the end of opening government, it's very, very clear that we win this debate. We explain first that war goes on for longer, something that is effectively conceded by opening opposition. Second, that you get more draconian war. And third, that you get more internal racism. Think about what the average reasonable person hears when they hear about war. They hear about death. They hear about people being tortured. They hear about people being napalmed and burnt to death. Those are the visceral impacts that are the biggest in the debate. That is why opening government must win this debate.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for a fine speech. May we now have the Deputy Leader of the Opposition close off the top.
Hello, can I just confirm that this is clear and audible?
Yep, it is.
All right, thanks so much. For POIs, please use voice. You can interrupt me, but don't badger. I'll be taking you before the 6 minute. If there are any, preferably please raise a BOI in between 5 and 6. I'll take you during that time. Before my speech, I'd just like to give a couple of shout outs. Shout out to UPDAHSR, shout out to UPDS. Some of them are observing in this round. Shout out to Bea as well from CAP. Shout out to my friends from all the other circuits out there and to my fellow finalists as well. All right, setting up my timer. Again, POIs through voice. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, now. War is what happens when language fails, when communication fails. It is the end of the spectrum that we're talking about. It's not the propaganda, so Deputy Prime Minister wasn't listening to our speech, meaning all other means and alternatives have been explored, such as negotiations, discussions, and concessions. It is an active choice for aggressors to engage in war for their own interests, like being able to establish their superiority, be it race or religion or ethnicity, being able to grant land and like engage in territorial disputes, having the desire for expansionism and whatnot. We think all of these causes of war, no matter how you justify to be legitimate, aren't justified. Only inhumane individuals go as far as killing other people. This introduction alone kills the entire 7 minutes of Prime Minister because they said these people deserve dignity. No, they deserved dignity. But at a point in which they choose to escalate because they did not get the compromise they wanted, they strip themselves of that dignity they think they also deserved. Prime Minister, they said that dehumanizing is like parallelizing individuals to animals, evil, they're not humans, and portraying the Japanese individuals to be ghost-like. I think this was extremely, extremely convenient because it's not parallelizing an aggressor to an animal, that's dehumanizing. Dehumanizing means you strip those aggressors of qualities that make them human, that they do not have empathy, that they do not have any sense of morality, that they will come to your door and not think twice in pulling the trigger of the gun pointed at you. But even if we bite their characterization, I don't see how exactly it strengthens their case. But let's engage, because they said that it makes it more likely for people to support racism on our side. I don't see why this is an exclusive harm on our side, which was pointed out by my LO, but note that OG missed out on who exactly uses this propaganda. It's literally the state. And so we think that if the state uses wartime propaganda that shows glory, which is their counterfactual, it's more likely to incite racist tendencies and comments on their side, because you show that there is a victor, because you show that there is a losing end, because you show that there is a superior race or a superior ethnicity and whatnot. Let's engage with Deputy Prime Minister, right? Because they said that OO said propaganda will be used as the last resort. Again, it's not propaganda, it's the war that is the last resort. OG cannot win this debate by blatantly misrepresenting opposition. They also said that we gave a singular counterfactual, which is simply untrue. We presented 3 possible scenarios and why they're unlikely to be effective in the middle of a war. They've been highly unresponsive to this. Instead, they seem to be against all sort of propaganda, which boxes them out of the debate because narratives inevitably form given the insatiable need people have to justify their actions. They said that we end and win the war when people no longer want to engage in it. The withdrawal of one party doesn't automatically result in the end of a war. We're only risking becoming further oppressed. Government had to prove why both sides of the war are likely to withdraw and kumbaya for this case to fly. I think that's too late for opening government. They're out of this debate. 3 extensions, therefore. Firstly, on how are people likely to react on the ground and why will this be effective? The premise is that wartime propaganda is used and propagated by the state. My partner told you a couple of reasons, like being able to incite action and public opinion from critical masses. But an additional reason here is that fear-mongering is a tactic that can be strategically used by the state to prepare the people on the ground for extreme instances, for the infinite possibilities of atrocities that might arise from a war. 3 levels of analysis. Firstly is that fear-mongering means people are better able to gain consciousness about what the enemy is capable of doing. At the point in which you paint, for example, aggressive soldiers as being demons who are likely going to have super big tanks and are going to shoot these missiles at you and whatnot, we think this gives individuals on the ground the propensity to be able to prepare how exactly they are able to approach this kind of scenario at the point in which push comes to shove. But secondly, fear-mongering also means people become more anxious, which is a good thing because it means people on the ground are increasing in vigilance. But lastly, the fear incited can be used as a state tool for clapback. We think that this fear can be weaponized into anger, that your lands might be stolen by inhumane soldiers, that your families might not have a country to live in because you were pushed into refugee status. The biggest harm opening government presented was people hating their enemy. Panel, it's war. People are bound to hate each other either way. The difference that is exclusive to dehumanization is the degree in which people are willing to be aggressive or conduct further action. More analysis in my second extension. For these reasons, what this first extension proves is that it will be effective because people being afraid is something that the state can use for their advantage and for the disadvantage of the enemy because they will be seen as inhumane. And this is something that, I don't know, maybe the enemies will not want on our side if government thinks that they care about their dignity. Second extension, even if we're ineffective, and this is us being charitable that we lose a war, for example, it's still okay. Because even if we lose, even if we have a lot of casualties, even if we lose lives, why is this fine? This is a response to Deputy Prime Minister when they said, OO is so fine with more and more people going to war. This exists on either side. There will be victors, there will be deaths. This also deals with a claim coming from Prime Minister on propaganda prolonging wars because you viscerally hate the opposition. I don't think it's any team's burden to prove that wars will end more immediately. This is not a policy debate. That's beyond state capacity, and that's obviously something that requires more than just propaganda. But what this debate is about, though, is the intrinsic feeling that victims of war and war crimes get, especially when their perceptions of their enemies is one that is skewed towards believing they are not as human as you are. And this is a good thing in opening opposition, because if you die a justified death because you lived up to your value of humanity, that you stood your ground and believed firmly that these oppressors are on the wrong side of history. Because if you die in opening opposition, especially because my LO contextualized, these occur in places and war-torn areas with high rates of religious and ethnic tensions, meaning you value humanity strongly because that is what your God tells you, because that is what your deity tells you. You believing these soldiers aren't human aligns with that belief and strengthens the belief that they go to you and kill you because they're inhumane. Therefore, that's something that you need to be able to stand up against. So I think that even if we lose, we win. At this point, there's no POI from CO and OO, from CG and OG. We're winning the debate. CG.
Yeah, OG.
People have proximity bias, which means that they only sympathize their own kind. Why would I sympathize a person who attacked my country?
I don't think that, no, sympathy is a claim coming from government bench because you say that these people deserve dignity, right? We're not saying that we should sympathize on opposition side because what we're claiming is that these individuals do not deserve any respect, do not deserve any dignity because they went as far as the end of the spectrum, which is war, because they went beyond compromise, which comes through the forms of negotiations and discussions, because they are unwilling to accept a consensus. Third extension, then, why we deter aggressors from such behavior, where this is a response to reduce racism and bigotry coming from government bench. This might seem like a stretch, but if I'm able to prove that this is likely, even if minute, we win over opening government and ultimately over closing government. Because they said the opposition still needs dignity and some sort of respect. We flip this on our side. We think that in OO, if these aggressors and opposition care so much about gaining dignity and respect from the other side, or like sympathy from closing government, that's better achieved in OO. How exactly? Because if it's a state propaganda, we think it's likely going to be so widespread and popular that it paints the entire opposition as evil, as inhumane, etc. So in terms of scope and propensity of being looked at in a negative light and biting into OG's analysis that these aggressors care about their dignity, we think it's all the more reason they will be culpable to a shift in behavior from aggression to compromising. It's unclear to me why OG is so offended by us dehumanizing soldiers who are also probably sexual assaulters when these soldiers are the ones who encroached on innocent civilians' civil liberties to begin with. For these reasons, OO wins the final.
I thank the speaker for that speech. That also ends the top half debate. Now kick off the back half debate. Maybe have the member of Gov. Also to be noted, the member of Gov and the GovLib do not consent to being recorded. I thank the speaker for that speech. May we now have the member of opposition propose a case for the closing off.
All right. TJ, no preference for pronouns, put PYs in the chat. I really want to shout out to Wayne, my partner, my student for the past, what, 2? Has it been 3 years already? Yes, been asking me for a tournament for the longest time, and I'm so happy to have been able to bring him all the way to this grand finals, and I hope you go further very far in your career. All right, cool. Yeah, PYs in the chat, said already. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The key framing you get in closing opposition, and ironically, it also actually comes from the member of government here, is when and where wartime propaganda is used. Because I think it's fair and it's absolutely correct for Ooki to point out that the top half argues in a context where nations go and fight wars with each other, which other than the fact that World War I and World War II kind of happened, is actually an anomaly and doesn't really happen in a majority of cases because there are a lot of structural barriers for large nations to go to war in the first place. International norms, backlash, and OG's own analysis, it's very hard to get the support of the people, which means the debate needs to happen in the context where this propaganda is the most effective in galvanizing action. And the most likely context here are places where people are desperately fighting to survive because they need a reason to believe they should continue fighting in the faces of insurmountable odds. I will firstly try and frame out like the stuff in opening government also, right? Like justifying war crimes and like, it's just very unlikely to be the context. Like, and some of it comes in member of government already. But if people generally don't feel a need to fight, they're just less likely to buy into propaganda. And intuition for this, you just compare the drive of local Ukrainians defending the state versus Russian invaders, right? Russian people have no motivation to fight in the first place. Ukrainian people are literally fighting for their lives. And for that reason, they have significantly more galvanized to fight against them. This is where this propaganda is most likely to be effective. As much as Russia tries to demonize the Ukrainian people, it's impossible for this propaganda to have the same kind of efficacy to galvanize Russian soldiers to commit crimes in Ukraine. That's why the converse is just significantly stronger. It's a reason why we support it, because it's most likely to help the most vulnerable actor in this case. Like OG's example of Japanese people being portrayed as ghosts, that's not the reason they support the bombing of Japan. The reason the US people supported is because the Japanese like fucking bombed Pearl Harbor, right? That is the reason why the US went to war in the first place. It was not the fact that they were characterized as ghost-like people. Propaganda is ineffective in motivating them to do bad stuff. But OG's claim that states need states need to have support from the people to go to war, unless there's clear aggression in this regard, it just proves it's very, very unlikely for states to go to war and do all the horrible things that they pointed out in opening government. States face a degree of backlash, right? US tried to justify the torture of suspected terrorists using racist rhetoric, but still received opposition from the people because the US people felt that even if these terrorists or these Arabic people were characterized as like very negative stereotype, it was still a reason why we ought not torture people for the reason that people ought have human rights. There are strong norms against going to war. International organizations that broker deals and sanctions. You don't actually fight wars because it's costly. I think very unlikely that this debate is about nations going to war. Not that it doesn't happen, but the context where this is most relevant is not when nations are aggressive. Why do we think the most relevant context is actually the context that CG talks about? But it's actually precisely because of that context that CG is going to move around. We agree significantly with their framing, right? But the end impact is just counterintuitive. Because their biggest claim is very difficult for nations to coexist if you do this kind of wartime propaganda. Like Eritrea and their other like partners need to be able to cooperate and work with each other. But that answers the question themselves. If nations constantly fight with each other, that's bad for the economy, that's bad for post-war reconstruction. So there are very clear political incentives for these nations not to fight wars in the first place, not to use propaganda to justify all these kinds of horrible things. Or even if they use the propaganda in those circumstances, not to actually go to war because that's a direct threat towards themselves. Like India and Pakistan, right? They hate each other. They regularly send troops above like over the border. They regularly screw around in Kashmir and like there's negative media coverage of each other. But they don't fight wars. They trade with each other. The EU still buys Russian oil because they need it, right? Even though Russia has done all kinds of horrible things. People bought oil from ISIS while ISIS was still around because like they're selling oil and the oil is cheap. All of these reasons suggest that by proximity, you're not going to use propaganda to enact this kinds of violence. And even in the case where you do use propaganda, it does not translate towards harm. I think like the CG impact just does not make sense in this round. Where do we think this is most relevant, therefore? It is in cases where people are in close proximity to each other and when they are non-state actors. But most importantly, is in cases where it is used in self-defense. Talk about civil war. When groups that have legitimate grievances cannot get their needs met through democratic means, they're then forced to take up arms. Like the LTTA in Sri Lanka, like the Taliban in Afghanistan, pushing back against US invaders, like the FARC rebel in Colombia, like Ukrainian defense forces pushing back against people in Russia. This is instances where violence is necessary as a metric to protect themselves. And this is where propaganda is most effective in galvanizing people because you are literally fighting for your life. In those cases, we say it is principally just the use of propaganda as a means for self-defense. This framing already wins closing opposition to debate because we're able to explain where the most relevant context where propaganda is being used over our opening, but also frames out a lot of the harm that Gusbench wants to talk about. Why do we think this is justified in terms of a principle? I'll take you to debate. The debate is most relevant in asymmetric warfare situation where propaganda is supplied by both sides but have differential effects. For the reasons that nations seldom go to war anymore because it's violence and conflict could happen internally. The impact here is threefold. Firstly, these smaller groups that have a reason to fight and use propaganda to galvanize the soldiers and the followers to go and fight have a greater capacity to fight. And in the absolute worst case, when it's a smaller group, they have no hope of absolutely winning. It is a principal right for them to do so to preserve their life and liberty against an oppressive state. Self-defense is in and of itself a justification for you to use violence is like recognized in court, right? And that's the reason as to why it is principally just for you to use propaganda as a means to defend your house in this case. Even if you're guaranteed to fail, the opposition of evil is itself a good. But second, we don't think you're always going to fail. There's an increased likelihood of success outside of the house by the usage of this galvanization. Oppressive states are not always unified. The larger you are as a state, the harder it is to manage everything, right? Which is why the Viet Cong fighting against the US Army used guerrilla tactics and eventually succeeded. The US went over to Vietnam and then fucking lost to rice farmers. That is the reason why the galvanization and the usage of self-defense, the use of this kind of propaganda is effective in having the capacity to push for change, pushing against oppressive people, the oppressive structures and states that would rather see you fail, because soldiers are more galvanized and significantly more likely to see it in our side as compared to the counterfactual. But finally, we actually disincentivize the threat of violence because people know that the use of propaganda means that these soldiers are going to be a lot more effective in the fighting, which is a disincentive to go to war in the first place. Because if both sides use propaganda, there's going to be very, very bloody. It's going to change the rational calculus of those leaders, whether it be state, whether it be civil role, whether it be minority group. Before I prove why this is true, I'll take OG.
Yeah, so you can't just support the good guys using it. You have to support everyone. And as Oscar points out, when you believe that your enemy is worse, that they aren't reasonable people, you'll never be able to sign a peace treaty that effectively ends the war because you always think they're a threat who will come back and will destroy your country.
I'm going to directly prove that you're more likely to get peace treaties on the outside of the house. But in response to the first part, I've already explained in the framing why the use of propaganda is more effective in our context than in yours. That's why even if it is used in your case, it is less likely to be effective or translate towards violence. Why do you think you're more likely to get like support or not go to war in the first place? Because this increases the threat of violence. It means that people are more likely to come to the table because they don't want to engage in all-out violent bloodshed with you, right? Like the FARC rebels in Colombia, like struck a deal for political representation, and as a result, were willing to lay down their arms. The LTT in Sri Lanka, same thing, extracted political concessions in exchange for laying down their arms. The Houthi rebels in Yemen, right? Saudi brokered the Riyadh deal in order to end the conflict between them. All of these prove that the threat of violence and the increased threat of violence by the galvanization mechanism of the propaganda increases the likelihood of people coming to the table because they don't want to fight these things any longer. The comparative is that the alternative to propaganda, like the presentation of information, always says you're more likely to be fearful. But in the context where you are a smaller group fighting an asymmetric war, there's so much more likely for you to give up, so much more likely for you to give in to things like tokenistic concession, and as a result have your rights fought. We think the use of propaganda as a means for self-defense is just so important that outweighs anything in this debate, and for that reason, we oppose.
Thank the speaker for that speech. May we now have the opposition, may we now have the government whip to close the closing up case. Also note that the government whip does not consent to be recorded.
All right, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
All right, just want to shout out to TJ. Just thank you for carrying me to like the finals. I guess I really hope that this is a time where like we stop losing finals, and yeah, we're just gonna win this. All right. All right, speech starting in 3, 2, 1. In times of an atrocity and in times of catastrophes that significantly perishes the fundamental ability to these mere human rights to survive, we stay on the side of closing opposition proudly, that a propaganda that ignites our hope to empower our ability to push against the unscrupulous and ecalias of our oppressors is a fundamental dignity, is to compromise our fundamental dignity, is the proudest thing to do. We're immensely proud to oppose. I'm going to do 2 things in this speech. The first is to explain why closing government entirely is out of this debate of a bunch of reasons, and second of all, would explain what the extension that TJ exclusively brought to you wins us this debate. First, and why PG is out, because understand that OG suggests why these propagandas actually aggravates wars and starts wars to begin with. But MD explains why why this is unlikely to occur. So the intuitive reason right here is that government and so there's an intuitive reason right here is that clearly a knife from CG. So if you're killing yourself with a knife you brought up, I don't think knifing has to do in debate. So that's the first reason why they're out. But second, it is the fact that government spent so much time attacking OG, literally half of their speech, instead of TJ's extension, literally is a testimony to the fact that literally is a misprioritization. But a third, I'll argue that all of these things are literally counterintuitive to the case, because they believe that it only occurs in instances which TJ told you, which is the instance which individuals utilize this as a form of self-defense. So people use it to defend themselves. It is unlikely to materialize realize any of the benefits they want to talk about. But lastly, thank you, because this is literally a necessity that we're attempting to prove on the closing opposition, which is that individuals only use and will use it in the context to defend themselves. So for these reasons, clearly in a strategic point, they're out. Let's move on to explain what extension TJ brought to you and why is the debate winning. I think there's two extensions that TJ brought to you. The first is the introduction of the context, exactly why this is more or not likely to be used in instances where small countries or weaker nations use it as a form of necessity to defend themselves against strong and literally unscrupulous oppressors. We told you it's unlikely to be used in massively aggravate wars or to allow stronger nations to perish weaker ones. We give you a number of reasons for this. The first is it suggests it's human intuitive to not want half wars. It's literally a bunch of giving blood threats apart and innocent individuals apart. The response the government had here was opposition seems to be assuming that all people are rational. That misses the nuance, because the nuance right here we're saying is that the leaders are rational, not all people are rational. Insofar as the leaders are rational in this particular point in time, they're unlikely to start wars. They need to prove exactly why leaders are irrational in the vast majority of cases in order for the benefit to fly, which we told you is very unlikely to occur. But the second reason that we told you is that it's mentally costly because it damages the economy of the country, and whatever the reasons that you want to talk about how it's hard to rebuild your economy, that is the exact reason it's why individuals are unlikely to go into war, even in the existence of this propaganda. But third, realize that it's a backlash and a pull out of support from the people. When the US attempted to justify the torture of terrorists back then, they still received an insurmountable degree of backlash on the opposition from the people. It is a testimony to the fact that it's mentally unlikely for the occur. But lastly, we explain the difference between soldiers in Ukraine being motivated to fight versus to self-defend themselves versus the Russian soldiers. They will never be to the same degree. It is a testimony to the fact exactly why Russia is not being successful right now. But also, shout out to OG's audacity to POIs and ask us to support them in all instances. We will clearly give you all of these reasons exactly what is unlikely to occur. So OG's concerns false, but also TG's arguments also false. But realize the importance of this particular piece of framing. Number one, it takes us above opening opposition. Because even if opening opposition shows, even if LO is able to show to some extent what it actually incites military action, it falls at a point to which OG suggests that those incites actually prolong and aggravate wars. It is only when TJ told you it is most likely to be used in cases of weaker nations to self-defend themselves. So it kills two birds in one stone. First, they take that opening government's argument about prolonging wars and starting wars. On the argument of prolonging war, if it is a form of self-defense, if somebody attacks you and you use it as a form of terrorist self-defense, that increases the likelihood for you to win. We gave you the example of the Vietnam War, for example, where you paint US troops as beings of ambiguity, beings of the unscrupulous, that inspire hope and ignite hope through the very fundamental motivation to allow people to fight and to not surrender. And literally the argument of starting wars, it sounds ridiculous right now, because if you make it, and it's miserable, because in the case in which you're defending yourself, it is ridiculous to suggest you are starting the war, which is literally implausible to occur. But second, this also takes us above opening opposition in this case, because we better respond to opening government, we better kill opening government in this case. But let's move on to the second part of the extension, where there's two parts actually to this particular impacting extension that TJ told you. The first is in terms of the practical impacting. It was severely lacking on the side of opening opposition. The first thing we told you is that you actually disincentivize individuals to fight. You actually disincentivize individuals to continue to fight wars. And we gave you evidences and factual examples exactly why peaceful treaties are actually signed as a result of this particular propaganda. We gave you the example on how the FARC rebels in Colombia struck a deal for political representation. We gave you the example on how the LTTA in Sri Lanka, that the concessions to lay down arms actually manifested in the past. We gave you the example on how the Houthi rebels in Yemen, where Riyadh deal brokers by Saudi actually materialized. All of these examples are literally testaments to the fact that peace treaties can be achieved, particularly because of this. Because if you paint your enemies as literal beings of the unscrupulous, that it is implausible for it to fight a war, that automatically allows you to surrender. But we told the second level of this, which is also incrementally important, that in the cases which is somehow plausible to whip, you incite and ignite hope to the very fundamental amounts of your soldiers. They will tell your soldiers, in fact, that these are the beings who have stripped away our human rights, and it's the only fundamental capacity for us to fight back and to retaliate, to push against these individuals. We think that's a fundamental thing, that it's a fundamental benefit for these individuals. But the last and the principle in impacting right here is in terms of a principle level. We told you it is a fundamental right for people to self-defend themselves. This can only be compromised on the side of closing opposition, insofar as we told you exactly why soldiers are a host of soldiers that ignited, and that is exactly why they're likely to fight for themselves. Realize that this is absence of the comparative to the government, insofar as in the absence of this propaganda, we told you, if we gave you examples of why Russian soldiers are so disempowering right now. And literally, that is also exactly why Russia is unable to there is also a testament to the fact exactly why it only occurs in our context, because we realize it is the fundamental fact that Russia is unable to utilize this particular narrative and utilize this propaganda to frame Ukrainians as extremely as animals and extremely bad beings. That is exactly why they're being motivated to some extent. At the very end of the day, it is only the side of closing opposition, but we told you practical implication. It is the first thing that we told you content exactly is why the mixes that actually clears up most of the themes on this debate. We framed out OG, we framed out OO, but last of all, it is only the practical impact that we told you exactly on our side of the house, where wars where we actually allow a more peaceful agreements to exist, but you also allow for the very fundamental right for individuals to self-defend themselves and to fight against the oppressors. We will not surrender the right to self-defense. On the side of closing opposition, we're so immensely proud to oppose for one very last time.